Shyla was not used to surprises. In fact, she would go so far as to say that surprises were for the weak, those unprepared for the reality of space. And after decades of being a soldier in the Queen's army, Shyla had long since stopped expecting anything other than the predictable grind of warfare. She knew the way of the galaxy: conquer, destroy, claim. It had always been that way. The prisoner, however, was supposed to be a different kind of surprise, or so her superior had claimed. The human was to be kept in isolation until he was needed for interrogation. But even before the orders arrived, Shyla knew he would be a problem. Human prisoners had a tendency to defy expectations, as though they were born with an innate talent for finding the one thing that would make the most sense to challenge. It was almost like they had a sixth sense for the absurd. So when Shyla walked into the observation room to inspect the human prisoner, she was mentally prepared for chaos. The stories had been spun like some kind of legend. This human was supposed to be a monster, a beast who fought with the savagery of 100 creatures. She expected wild eyes, snarling, a creature whose very presence threatened the order she had sworn to uphold. What she found instead was a man sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, his back straight as though he were meditating. His eyes were closed, but there was an unsettling stillness to him, as though he were waiting for something, maybe her. "Are you going to just sit there and stare at me, or will you speak?" The voice was calm, too calm for someone who should have been terrified, according to the reports. Shyla blinked. That was not what she expected. "I was just about to say hello," she said, stepping forward, her boots clicking sharply on the metallic floor. The man, his name was Elias, according to the database, opened his eyes slowly, studying her with a gaze that held none of the fear she had anticipated. His gaze was steady, unblinking, and for a brief second, Shyla found herself surprised by the lack of animosity in his stare. "You're not what I expected," he said, tilting his head slightly. That made Shyla pause. "I could say the same about you. I was told to expect an out-of-control monster." Elias chuckled, a soft, amused sound. "Well, I suppose you're in for a disappointment then. I'm not in the mood for a fight, and to be honest, it's a little too cold for that." She blinked again. Cold. The temperature in the cell was always the same, artificially controlled and, frankly, uncomfortable for everyone but her. "What exactly do you think you're doing in here?" He shrugged, the movement almost nonchalant. "Meditating, trying to clear my head before whatever comes next." "Clear your head? You're in a prison, and you're trying to meditate?" Shyla couldn't help herself. The absurdity of it was just too much. "Is this some kind of human coping mechanism?" "Not really," he said, still not looking at her. "But it helps me think, which, when you're dealing with, well, whatever this is probably a good idea. I find that panic never really solves anything." Shyla crossed her arms, leaning against the wall, trying to ignore the uncomfortable shift in her own posture. "You're supposed to be an enemy of the Queen. Don't you care at all about where you are?" "Not really," he replied, his voice flat, as though they were talking about nothing at all. "I mean, I'd prefer not to be in prison, but I've been in worse places, and at least the food here is better than the last place." "Better?" Shyla's tone dripped with skepticism. "This place has the most bland rations in the galaxy. There's a reason we call them nutrient bricks. They're not meant to be gourmet." He raised an eyebrow. "Trust me, I've had worse. Ever eaten a ration that tasted like burnt metal and regret? That's what I had for a month once. This place is practically a luxury suite by comparison." Shyla had to fight the laugh that threatened to escape. "You're an odd one, aren't you?" "That's what they tell me," Elias said with a smile, the first real one she had seen on his face. It was strange, disarming even. "But I suppose you get to be odd when you're busy surviving." Surviving. That word hung in the air between them like a puzzle piece she didn't know how to place. In all her years as a soldier, she had never thought about survival beyond the fight, beyond the orders given to her. It had never occurred to her that someone like him might survive without being caught up in the same endless cycle of violence that defined her existence. "I was told you were dangerous," Shyla said after a moment, her voice more serious now, "that you had a special skill." Ilias shrugged again, but this time the gesture seemed less dismissive. Special skill? I suppose I'm good at staying alive. That's about it. Staying alive, Shyla echoed, confused. What's so special about that? Isn't that just basic instinct? Not when the universe is trying to kill you at every turn. Trust me, staying alive requires some creative thinking. He looked up at her, his gaze no longer just calm, but piercing, like he could see straight through her. You should try it sometime. Might help you see things differently. Shyla opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but something about what he said felt important. You really think you can change the way I see things? She asked, her tone softening against her will. Elise's smile returned, more knowing now. Maybe not, but if you don't even try, you'll never know. And that's the problem, isn't it? You've never really asked yourself if the things you've been told are true, have you? That was a challenge, a direct hit, one that pierced something deep inside Shyla. Her entire existence had been shaped by the orders she had followed, by the beliefs she had absorbed since birth. Never once had she questioned the truth. But now, standing in front of this calm, non-threatening prisoner, she found herself wondering, was it possible that everything she had been told was wrong? Before she could respond, Elias tilted his head and gave her a small smile. Look, I'm just saying, if you want to know the truth, you might want to start by asking the right questions. Otherwise, you might just miss it. Shyla stared at him for a long moment, her mind spinning. She had never met anyone like him. He was too calm, too collected, too different from the raving, aggressive enemies she had been trained to fight. Finally, she straightened. I'll be back tomorrow, she said curtly, turning to leave the cell. As she walked away, Elias's voice stopped her. And Shyla? She turned, one eyebrow raised. Don't forget to ask yourself that question, he said, his voice light, almost teasing. You might just find something worth thinking about. For the first time, Shyla wasn't sure whether she wanted to hear more. Shyla had never been particularly fond of silence. In her line of work, silence was a warning, a harbinger of danger or a precursor to unexpected chaos. It was a space that allowed thoughts to creep in, thoughts that didn't have answers. And lately those thoughts seemed to always lead back to Elias. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had spoken to her, his calmness, his seemingly unshakable composure. The questions he had posed, they buzzed in her mind like a relentless drone, demanding her attention even when she tried to focus on something else. The steady hum of the ship, the rhythm of her patrol, the orders she followed, all of it had become a blur. Even the smell of nutrient bricks didn't seem to bother her as much anymore. It wasn't until the third day after their first conversation that she found herself walking back to his cell, against her better judgment. She had promised herself she wouldn't entertain his ideas, that she would remain professional, keep her distance. But there was something about the way he had looked at her, like he saw more than just a soldier. It gnawed at her. It shouldn't have, but it did. Back again, huh? Elias's voice rang out as she approached the cell. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his legs crossed. A standard pose for prisoners, though Shyla couldn't quite reconcile the peaceful aura he carried with the idea of someone locked up for a rebellion. Don't get too excited, I'm just doing my job, she replied, even though the words felt hollow the moment they left her mouth. She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Elias looked up at her, a glint of humor dancing in his eyes. I don't think I've ever seen someone so determined to not enjoy their job. Shyla narrowed her eyes, but she couldn't suppress the faintest hint of a smile. I enjoy it just fine, she muttered. It's what I've trained for. Sure, Elias said, clearly unconvinced. You know, if you're really good at something, it shouldn't feel like a chore. Just saying. Shyla leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. She wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or intrigued. And what exactly would you know about being good at something? I've been really good at surviving, Elias said, his tone light but serious. Which, by the way, is an underrated skill, keeps you alive long enough to do all the fun stuff. Fun stuff? Shyla raised an eyebrow. Like being captured by the Queen's forces? Exactly, he said, the smile tugging at the corner of his lips again. You know, it's not often that I get to meet someone who's so eager to stay on the other side of things. I mean, the Queen's soldiers don't exactly have the best reputation for open-mindedness. Shyla found herself laughing before she could stop it. I'm not sure I'd call it open-mindedness. More like following orders without questioning. There it is, Elias said, raising his hand in mock celebration. That's the part where I get to say, I told you so. It's like you've been trained to shut off your brain whenever someone says, do this, do that. I haven't shut off anything, Shyla snapped, but there was no real heat behind her words. Instead, she found herself curious. Why did he keep saying things like that? Why did he always question her, always make her wonder? Look, Elias, you don't know anything about my life. You don't know how it works out here. He didn't flinch. I know that you're here, and that means you've been caught up in something bigger than yourself, just like the rest of us. I don't have to know everything to know that. For a long moment, Shyla said nothing. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had a way of distilling everything down to the bare truth, and that always made it harder to ignore the gnawing discomfort in her chest. You're not even scared of me, are you? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Ilias shook his head slowly. Nope. I've met worse. She let out a short laugh, genuinely surprised. Worse? What could possibly be worse than the Queen's soldiers? Elias's grin spread wider, and for the first time she saw the true depth of his amusement. Oh, you'd be amazed. Some of the things I've run into would make your eyes pop out of your skull. I mean, have you ever heard of the Banthrax? Shyla stared at him, momentarily thrown off course. The Banthrax? That's a myth. It's just something the rebels made up to scare people. Sure, Elias said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Just like the nocturnal raptors of Andromeda and the devourers of the fourth moon, all made up to keep the little soldiers in line. Shyla rolled her eyes. You really expect me to believe that? Elias shrugged. Believe what you want, but the Banthrax? Real as you are. They eat anything that moves, and they're pretty fond of chasing down spaceships. You know, for sport. Her mind was racing. You're not serious. I swear I'm not pulling your leg. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, you learn to be a little creative with how you stay alive. There it was again. That word. Survive. The way Elias used it so casually, as if it were just part of everyday life. Shyla had never had to think about survival beyond the scope of her training, but Elias, he lived it. He breathed it. He saw things differently. I still don't get it, she said, folding her arms tighter, her thoughts churning. Why do you keep talking to me like this? Why not just wait for your trial or whatever? You're supposed to be the enemy, remember? He met her gaze steadily, that same serene calm in his eyes. Maybe because I don't think I'm your enemy. Maybe I'm just someone who's stuck in a bad situation, just like you. Shyla didn't know how to respond to that. She was supposed to see him as a threat. He was the enemy, after all. But all she saw was a man who seemed oddly at peace, despite everything that had happened to him. It made no sense, and yet the more she thought about it, the more it unsettled her. You're not what I expected, she muttered, mostly to herself. Elias grinned again. I get that a lot. Shyla found herself shaking her head, a rueful smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I don't know whether to hate you or start taking notes. Hey, I'm just here for the entertainment, Elias said, his tone light, but his eyes never leaving hers. Maybe a little perspective along the way wouldn't hurt either. She didn't have an answer to that. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, uncertain of what to make of him, of the strange calm that seemed to radiate from him, like some kind of cosmic joke she wasn't getting. I'll see you tomorrow, Shyla said at last, turning away. Elias's voice stopped her. You know, Shyla, you really ought to start thinking for yourself. It's a hell of a lot more fun than just following orders. She paused, turning slightly to look back at him. Maybe, but it's a lot riskier, Elias shrugged. Sometimes the best things are. And just like that, she was walking away, her mind racing, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she was more scared of the enemy in her custody or the enemy inside her head. The hum of the ship had become more of a background murmur now. Shyla barely noticed it anymore, her thoughts drifting through the corridors like a wayward vessel on a slow, uncharted course. It had been 3 weeks since the first conversation with Elias, and everything in her world had shifted. The orders were still the same. The mission still came down with the weight of inevitability, but there was something different in the way she approached them. She had thought the prisoner, this human, would be just another notch on the tally of captured enemies. Another body to interrogate, another life to erase from the map. But instead, she had found herself questioning everything she knew. And that was not something Shyla was used to. The Queen's forces had been closing in on the rebel stronghold for months, but something about it all seemed hollow now, like chasing shadows in the dark. She had grown used to seeing the rebellion as the enemy, the cause of everything wrong in the galaxy. But now, after everything Elias had said, after the countless hours spent listening to his thoughts on survival, freedom, and purpose, she wasn't sure where the line between enemy and ally truly lay. Shyla found herself standing outside Elias's cell again, the door silently sliding open as she approached. She had come to realize that this was no longer about keeping him imprisoned. It wasn't about extracting information or extracting vengeance. It was something else, something deeper. Inside, Elias was sitting at his usual spot, cross-legged, calm. If there was one thing that hadn't changed since their first meeting, it was his uncanny ability to remain grounded in the face of everything. If she had been in his shoes, she would have gone mad by now, or at least tried to escape. But Elias had done neither. He was peaceful. Too peaceful. "Back again?" he asked without opening his eyes, his voice a familiar, easy rhythm. Shyla leaned against the doorframe. "I can't stay away. You make it too hard to ignore you." He finally opened his eyes, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Oh, I knew I was irresistible," Shyla smirked, despite herself. "That's the last thing I'd call you." "You're just playing hard to get," he said with a wink, his smile widening. She rolled her eyes, but there was a warmth in her chest, something unfamiliar. It had been so long since she had let herself feel anything but duty and obedience. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice softer than usual, "about everything you've said, about the rebellion, about the Queen, about survival." "Ah, the great existential crisis of Shyla the Invincible," Elias teased. "I knew this was coming. I should have brought snacks." She frowned. "This isn't a joke. I'm serious." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just saying, if you need a distraction, I've got all sorts of tales. You wouldn't believe the time I outsmarted a Canarian bounty hunter using nothing but a rusty spoon and a piece of string." Shyla crossed her arms, though there was a reluctant chuckle that escaped her lips. "Maybe later. This isn't about your ridiculous stories." All right. I'll put my comedic genius on hold. What's going on in that brilliant brain of yours?" She sighed, looking down at her boots. "I don't know anymore. I used to think everything was so simple. There were the Queen soldiers, and there were the rebels. We fought. We conquered. That was it. But now it feels like there's no clear side anymore. I'm not sure I even know what I'm fighting for." Elias studied her for a long moment, his expression serious for the first time in weeks. "And that scares you, doesn't it?" "It's not the uncertainty that scares me," she said quietly. "It's the idea that maybe I've been on the wrong side this whole time." The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. But then Elias spoke, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Shyla, there's no right side in a war. There's just survival. And survival's a funny thing. You can do it by following orders, but it's never going to give you meaning." "Not really." She looked up at him, searching his face for some hint of mockery, but there was none. Just a quiet sincerity that made her stomach churn with something unfamiliar. "What do you mean by meaning?" "Meaning's what you make of it," he said with a shrug. "Look, I don't know what's going on in that big shiny palace of a mind of yours, but I know one thing. You can't just live your whole life being told what to do. If you want something more, something real, you've got to decide for yourself." "Are you trying to give me advice?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and amusement. "From a prison cell?" "I'm just here to offer perspective," Elias replied with a grin. "Trust me, I've seen the galaxy from places far worse than this, and I've survived. So can you." The word stung, but in a way she couldn't quite explain. Survival isn't the problem, she said, her voice shaking slightly. It's what happens after. What happens when you realize everything you thought you knew was wrong? Elias's expression softened, and for the first time Shyla saw a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. That's when the real fight begins. She blinked, thrown off balance. The real fight? Yeah, Elias said. The one you fight with yourself, with your choices. It's the one that lasts long after the war's over. Shyla stared at him for a long time, unsure of what to say. Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, but one thing had become clear. Elias had been right about one thing. There was no real side to this war, no black and white morality, just choices. Choices that shaped who you became, not just what you fought for. A soft alarm suddenly blared throughout the ship, cutting through the stillness of the room. It was a familiar sound, an alert that signaled an attack was imminent. Looks like it's showtime, Elias said, getting to his feet with a wry smile. Tell me, Shyla, you ever been in a real fight? She didn't answer immediately. The weight of what he had said hung in the air, pressing down on her. But as the ship's alarm continued to blare and her training kicked in, she finally straightened. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. But we're not doing this the old way? Elias raised an eyebrow. Now we're talking. Shyla stood taller than she had in days, the weight of her decisions settling into her bones like a new kind of armor. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was making the choice for herself. No more blindly following orders. No more being a pawn in someone else's game. As she left the room, heading toward the command center, Elias's voice echoed in her mind. The real fight begins when you decide for yourself. And Shyla knew, whatever came next, she had already won the only battle that truly mattered. The translator on his wrist was still rebooting when Leo Mercer realized the cliff edge he'd parked his diplomatic shuttle on was no longer a cliff edge at all, but an expanding sinkhole with a strong opinion about gravity. He let out a strangled yelp, flailed backward into a low crawl, and landed hard on his rear just as the entire patch of ground hissed, cracked, and collapsed into a purple fog of mineral vapor. Well, he muttered to himself, brushing off moon dust in pride, that's a first. Planet tries to eat the ambassador before I've even insulted anyone. The moon, Calith 3A, uncharted, uninhabitable, and supposedly irrelevant, had been a navigation error. A glitch in Elyari space distorted coordinates, and now he was 2 solar hours from any rescue, with a fried comlink, a broken shuttle, and the local wildlife screaming like tiny banshees at dusk. Leo squinted at the horizon. The jagged spires of a canyon shimmered under the light of a bloated red star, and something metallic glittered in the far distance. A structure? A ship? Or, knowing his luck, a really shiny carnivorous plant. He grabbed his pack, slung it over one shoulder, and began to walk. 2 hours and one deeply personal encounter with a sentient cactus later, Leo stumbled across the entrance to what appeared to be a temple, or a ruin, or maybe just Elyari architecture in the middle of having a nervous breakdown. The structure stood solemn and triangular, half buried in the sand, humming faintly with that low, strange thrum, common to technology older than most civilizations. He passed through a translucent threshold that buzzed against his skin like static, and stepped into the cool shade of the interior, and stopped. She stood in the center of the chamber, backlit by shafts of pale blue light, filtering through broken glass. Her armor was intricately layered, elegant and brutal all at once, glinting with living circuitry that pulsed like veins. Her long ears twitched slightly at the sound of his entrance. Yellow hair fell in a thick braid down her back, and her eyes, those eyes turned to him with a stare that could melt steel or at least permanently damage one's ego. Great, Leo said. The local war goddess is home. She didn't move, didn't speak, not at first. Then in perfect but frost-edged English, she said, "You have trespassed on sacred ground, human." He raised both hands. "Technically, I crash-landed. There's a difference. One involves intention, the other involves a broken gyroscope and a ship AI that thought a black hole looked cuddly." Her brow arched just slightly. "Also," he added, You're not supposed to be here either. Last I checked, Eliari royalty doesn't slum it on outlawed moons. A pause, then a quiet, controlled exhale. I am not here by choice. Ah, so we're both unwilling guests of the same galactic hospitality program. She turned away from him and began adjusting a panel embedded in the wall, fingers moving with precision and strength. The air in the room thickened. The hum grew louder. Okay, so this is the part where we either work together or die separately, he said. Personally, I vote together. I'm very charming when not dehydrated and bleeding internally. No, she replied. No to what? No to both. You are not charming, and you are not bleeding. Leo peered at his elbow. Okay, minor bleeding. I stand by it. She paused again. Something flickered across her expression. Doubt, amusement, or indigestion possibly. Eliari facial cues were notoriously tricky. Who are you? She finally asked. Captain Leo Mercer, diplomatic envoy, planetary embarrassment. Depends who you ask. And you must be, he frowned. You know, I actually don't know your name. Want to exchange life stories over a fire made from awkward silence and crushed expectations? Her gaze was ice. I am Sarah Vera, Queen of the Eliari, and this is not a conversation. He blinked, then gave a low, impressed whistle. Wow, okay. That explains the armor, and the posture, and the vibe of I could kill you with my earlobe. She turned back to her work, muttering something in Eliari that the translator hadn't caught up to yet. Leo let the silence linger a few beats, then moved slowly toward a secondary console. What are you trying to fix? The environmental regulator. This structure is the only shielded shelter within 100 kilometers. The regulator maintains breathable air. Oh, so minor importance then. She gave him a look that implied he was lucky to still be breathing any air, breathable or otherwise. Can I help? You may sit and remain silent. He sat. He did not remain silent. So, he said after 30 seconds, this place sacred to your people? Or is that just what you say when you don't want visitors? She sighed. It is sacred and forbidden. Excellent. Love that for us. The regulator gave a sputter, then a sharp hiss. Sarah Vera frowned and stepped back. Leo leaned closer. That's not a normal hiss. Number that is a coolant breach. Oh good, Nitzon, Leo said. So now the thing keeping us alive wants to explode. Sarah Vera moved quickly, stripping off one layer of her armored glove and thrusting her hand into a glowing panel. Light flared around her wrist, and the humming grew louder, more frantic. Leo watched in stunned awe as the technology responded not just to her touch, but to her very presence, shifting in color and frequency. That's not standard tech. It is Eliari Royal Class Biosynchronic Metal. Sounds expensive. It is alive. Even better. Does it take bribes? She glanced at him. Only in blood. Right. I'll just stay over here. The hum steadied. The hiss died. The air softened, warmed. Sarah Vera withdrew her hand, and for just a moment her shoulders sagged. You fixed it, Leo said. For now. So what's next? Cozy up and wait for rescue? There will be no rescue. Of course there won't, he muttered, because that would be convenient. She lowered herself to sit on the floor, still poised like a coiled weapon. He sat across from her, cross-legged, careful not to lean on anything that might insult him in another language. A long silence stretched. Finally, she spoke again. You should not be here. Neither should you. Their eyes met. And in that strange, suspended moment, something ancient stirred in the dust and circuitry. Not fear, not hostility, something else. He grinned. Well, Your Majesty, if we're breaking rules anyway, want to learn how to play rock, paper, scissors? Sarah Vera had expected many consequences from her choice to remain on Calith. Treason, exile, execution. She had not, however, anticipated the steady deterioration of her patience caused by a man who sang songs to a rock he'd named Carl. It calms the nerves, Leo explained, strumming the jagged edges of Carl like a lute. Music therapy, very popular on Earth. Carl and I are getting through some stuff. She did not reply. Her stomach twisted again, an alien sensation to her, and she'd fought parasites that could scream in 11 dimensions. She placed a hand gently over her abdomen, fingers tingling with unfamiliar energy. No Eliari had ever carried another species child. There was no guidance, no ancient wisdom, just this swelling warmth and chaos, and a man who serenaded stones. "It is not safe here," she said without turning. "We must move soon." Leo looked up from Carl with mock offense. "Are you saying the haunted ruin with the temperamental climate system isn't a perfect maternity ward?" "I am saying the Eliari will find us." He opened his mouth, thought better of it, and nodded. "Yeah. I had a dream last night that someone threw a diplomatic treaty at my head. I woke up with a nosebleed. Might be unrelated." She walked to the console, its lights dimmer now, reacting sluggishly to her touch. The structure was failing, and so was her strength. The pregnancy altered everything, her connection to the biosynchronic systems, her internal regulation of energy. Her skin flickered with faint pulses of light when she stood too quickly, and Leo had taken to calling her glowworm whenever she forgot to glare at him. "You're eating less," he said, not looking at her. "I noticed, and you're glowing more. Pretty sure that's not normal, unless Eliari have a disco mode I don't know about." She didn't answer. Couldn't. Partly because she didn't know the answer herself, and partly because her body was humming again. The hum came in waves now, centered beneath her ribs, a kind of resonance that sent her balance tilting and her mind spiraling into strange colors. The child was growing. Fast. Leo stood slowly. "You need rest." "There is no time." "There is if we take it," he said. "Sarah, you're literally sparking. If you explode, I'm going to be really upset. And also dead." She sat reluctantly, her knees folding in a way that tried to accommodate both dignity and fatigue. Leo crouched nearby, producing from his pack what he proudly referred to as human nutrition squares, which were possibly made of despair and shoe rubber. "Eat," he said. "I would rather chew metal." "These taste like metal, so you're in luck." She accepted the square, chewed once, swallowed with diplomatic detachment. Leo watched her for a while, then shifted closer. "I keep wondering if this was supposed to happen. This? You, me, this moon, this baby." She exhaled slowly. "Eliari do not believe in fate," he smiled. "Humans do. We also believe in coffee that burns your soul and animals wearing costumes. So I'm not saying we're reliable, but maybe this wasn't a glitch. Maybe it was a correction." The console behind them beeped weakly. A flicker of light raced across its surface. Sarah turned her head just enough to catch the signal. "Something approaches." Leo's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, a model so outdated even smugglers called it quaint. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away, her senses sharpened, the resonance in her chest spiking. She touched the console. The image shimmered. A ship, Eliari class. Not military, but not civilian either. Black hull, red marking. Blood signed, a hunter's vessel. Hunter as in bounty hunter. "No," she said, "as in Royal Extermination Protocol." Leo's face paled. "Ah, the polite kind of death." She stood. Energy flared from her palms. "We must leave. Now." They packed quickly. The structure gave one final groan of disapproval as they exited, as if disappointed to see them go. Leo spared a last glance at Carl. "Sorry, buddy. We'll always have the chorus." The landscape was cruel. Razor-sharp stones. Wind that whispered secrets no one wanted to hear. Sarah moved with practiced speed despite the growing ache in her limbs. Leo jogged beside her, occasionally swearing at gravity. They reached the ravine by nightfall, the sky above choked with metallic clouds. Sarah paused, scanning the ridge. "Down there," she said, "a hidden relay station, abandoned decades ago. It may still function." "I love maybes," Leo said. "They go so well with possibly dying." They slid down the rocky path, Sarah shielding her stomach with her arm as tremors began again. Small, fluttering things beneath the skin. Inside her, something was shifting. The station was a rusted dome covered in sand and half-eaten by moss. The door responded to her touch, reluctantly, coughing out a burst of stale air and a faint groan. They stepped inside. Dust swirled in the dim light. The air carried a faint tang of copper and ozone. Consoles lined the walls, flickering erratically. Leo found a seat shaped like a cruel joke and sat down with a groan. This place is cozy, if cozy meant haunted by mechanical regrets. Sarah Vera moved to the main console and began syncing her pulse with its systems. The response was immediate, faster than expected. The station was old, yes, but not dead. "This could work," she said. "We can send a pulse, a false trail. Make them think we're somewhere else?" She nodded. He whistled. "I love it when you get all subversive. It's very espionage meets maternal glow." She ignored him. Her hand trembled as she calibrated the signal. The station resisted, then relented. A spike of data fired into the void. Coordinates. A ghost. The hum in her chest answered, louder than before. She gripped the edge of the console, eyes wide. "Sarah Vera?" Leo was standing now. "What's happening?" She sank to her knees. "It's the child," she whispered. He moved fast, kneeling beside her. "What do I do? Is there an Eliari Lamaze method? Should I rub your ears?" She laughed, sharp and breathless. "Number just stay." He did. They waited there, beneath the failing lights and ancient machines, surrounded by echoes of forgotten science. She breathed. He counted. Outside, the storm began. The station's walls throbbed faintly now, responding to the subtle shifts in pressure, vibration, heartbeat. Everything had gone quiet inside Sarah Vera. No more tremors, no more flickering lights under her skin. Just an immense, humming stillness, the kind of quiet that came before things broke open, or never broke again. Leo had constructed a makeshift cot from decommissioned data pads and what appeared to be the top half of an ancient translator droid. The droid occasionally muttered in defunct trade dialects, mostly curses, which Leo insisted added charm. Sarah Vera lay back, her breath controlled but shallow. Sweat glistened across her brow. Leo sat beside her with all the calm of a squirrel in a thunderstorm. "You're doing great," he said. "At least I think you are. I've never done this before. Not even the Earth version. But you're glowing again, and that seems like a positive sign, unless it means you're overheating, in which case we should probably crack a window." "Do not crack anything," she said between breaths. He nodded solemnly. "No cracking, copy that. We're on a strict no-crack policy." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the cot as another wave hit. Something shifted deep inside. Something not just biological. It was like the resonance of two species realigning their physics mid-birth. She could feel it, the molecular negotiation. This wasn't just a birth. It was a rewriting. Outside, thunder rolled. The hunter ship had landed an hour ago, just over the ridge, dark and silent. No weapons had fired yet, which meant they were being watched. Leo had wanted to escape again. She had said no. She was tired of running. This was where it would happen, whatever it was, either the end or something else. He moved to the console again, tapping keys in a rhythm she recognized now as nervous fidgeting. "I've rerouted the station's pulse again," he said, "through a decoy into the methane fields. Maybe they'll chase ghosts for a while." "They won't." "Sure they will. Who wouldn't chase a good ghost? That's the essence of optimism." A new contraction overtook her, and she groaned, this time less from pain than from sheer surprise. The sensation was like being hollowed out and filled with light. Her hands lit up again, and so did her eyes, and for a moment the whole station was bathed in pale, pulsing blue. Leo stared. "Okay, now I'm definitely underqualified. Are you going supernova? Do I need to evacuate my soul?" "I am not exploding. Just checking." The child was close now. She could feel its pulse nested inside hers, its shape unfamiliar and sacred. Something between, something new. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Leo froze. His hand went to his weapon. Then, remembering it only held one charge and a grudge, he lowered it. The door opened. Sarah Vera didn't look up. She couldn't. But Leo turned, arms up in something halfway between surrender and sarcasm. "Gentlemen," he said to the armored figures, "if you're here for the show, I charge extra for front row seats." 3 Eliari stepped inside. Hunters, yes, but not dressed for violence. No blades drawn. One held a device scanning the air. Another looked at Saravira, then down at the cot. Their leader, a tall female with markings that shimmered like constellations, stepped forward. She lives, Leo blinked. We're going with observation as your opening move? Not, hey, you committed interstellar treason? She lives, the woman repeated, eyes on Saravira. And the child is intact. Saravira managed a whisper. You came to destroy us. No, the woman said. We came to see if the legends were true. Legends, Leo said. Okay, who's been leaking our plot arc? The Eliari knelt, not as a servant kneels, as a witness kneels. Her face softened. It should not be possible, she said, but the void shifts, and sometimes, so must we. Another contraction, deeper this time, and Saravira cried out. The energy flared again, casting shadows of all their species across the wall. Human, Eliari, and something brighter. Minutes stretched. The child came not with screaming but with light, a pulse like a song being born. Saravira felt the shift in gravity, in meaning. Leo caught the child in trembling hands and for once said nothing at all. He passed the newborn to Saravira, his expression unreadable, caught between awe and hilarity. She has ears, he whispered. Long ones. Saravira looked down, and a laugh broke from her chest. Unexpected, raw, full of something she'd never let herself feel before. Of course she does, she said. She is ours. The Eliari leader approached slowly. You have named her? Leo opened his mouth. Saravira beat him to it. Solari. There was a silence that wasn't empty. The hunters bowed their heads. Solari, the woman echoed. The bridge. Leo rocked back on his heels. That's either poetic or prophetic, and I'm too sleep-deprived to know which. Later, after the station dimmed to its usual gloom and the baby slept curled in the crook of Saravira's arm, Leo sat beside her. So, not dead, not arrested, and not exploded. No, she said softly, not any of those. We're parents. Apparently. I'm going to need some kind of manual or a laser-proof diaper. You'll adapt. He leaned back, watching the stars through the cracked ceiling. She's going to change everything, isn't she? She already has. The hunters departed at dawn. No threats, no charges. Just a message relayed through light. The future has already begun. They stayed a while longer, repaired what they could, sent signals. Buried Carl beneath the station, with honors Leo insisted were both noble and completely made up. When they finally left the moon, it was aboard a vessel cobbled together from human salvage and Eliari tech, flying under no flag but one of silence and stars. Their course was unknown, their path unwritten, but the child in Saravira's arms glowed faintly in her sleep, and every now and then, Leo swore he could hear her humming. The forest floor hissed beneath her as she moved, each step a whisper of scorched boots on steaming moss, each breath a battle against the thick, resin-sweet air of this cursed planet. Zira crouched behind the ruined fin of her scout vessel, one long ear twitching involuntarily as a burst of heat bloomed from the mangled engine core. Somewhere behind her, the stabilizer let out a prolonged wheeze like an elderly Grosnar wheezing its last. She flinched. This place reeked of failure and noise, of sweat and oxidized metal, and worst of all, humans. She knew what to expect. Training simulations had fed her endless scenarios, human war cries, brutish laughter, broken bones in the red dirt. Her instructor's voice echoed in memory. If they find you, girl, scream only to mark your location. We'll collect what's left. Comforting stuff. The forest around her was an angry tangle of violet vines and glistening bark that pulsed faintly with bioluminescent veins. Things rustled. Things clicked. Something the size of her head and shaped like a toaster buzzed past her ear and belched out a puff of what might have been music. She ducked instinctively. It circled back once, offended by her lack of appreciation, then zipped off with a self-important twiddle. A drone? A pet? Or just this planet's idea of wildlife? Zira tightened her grip on the cracked emergency scanner clutched in her hands, thumbed the signal key, and got the same response she'd gotten for the last 3 hours. A pitiful blink, then silence. The transmitter might as well have been a glorified flashlight. Her shoulders sagged. Then the sound came. Footsteps, heavy ones. Not the erratic flutter of a drifting drone or the crunch swish of local fauna, but a steady, two-legged gait. Biped, mass, significant, humanoid, possibly carnivorous, probably armed. She threw herself flat against the wreckage, heart pounding. Her mind raced. Should she run, hide, play dead? What if humans tracked by scent? Was that a thing? No one ever told her if that was a thing. The steps stopped. A shadow fell across the scorched grass. "I'm not gonna lie," a voice said low and gruff. "This is the weirdest squirrel I've ever seen." Zira blinked. The figure crouched, and she found herself face to face with the creature from her nightmares. Tall, stubbly, hair sticking out at angles that suggested poor sleep and worse grooming habits. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and he smelled faintly of burnt coffee and something chemical. But his eyes were not cruel, curious, possibly sleep-deprived. "You know," he said, scratching the back of his head with a grease-blackened hand, "you're a bit short for a local. Also, most of them don't glare at me like I owe them money." Zira narrowed her eyes. He had spoken in standard. Fluent standard. She wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. He reached into the side pouch of a battered tool belt and pulled out what looked like a ration bar wrapped in foil that had lost the will to live. With a flick, he tossed it toward her feet. "I come in peace. Also with snacks." She did not move. The snack could be poisoned, or explosive, or worse, flavored like that horrifying vegetable paste from the diplomatic conference last cycle. The man sighed. "Look, I'm Jack. My ship ate a tree a few kilometers that way, and unless you're planning on vaporizing me, maybe we can form a club. Stranded Idiots Anonymous." Still crouched, he looked around the wreckage. His gaze lingered on the engine core. Still crouched, he looked around the wreckage. His gaze lingered on the engine core before he gave a low whistle. "You're lucky you still have eyebrows." Zira's fingers twitched toward her head. She did, in fact, still have eyebrows. Relief was not the emotion she expected to feel in that moment. Jack stood, brushed dirt from his knees, and peered up at the sky. "No signal, no rescue beacon, and I'm pretty sure the weather here has a personal vendetta against us. Welcome to Planet Nope." He took a step back, still keeping his hands visible. "Tell you what, I'll set up camp over there, by that rock that looks like it wants to eat me. You can come join me if you decide I'm less threatening than your average malfunctioning coffee bot." He ambled off, whistling a tune that sounded suspiciously like the theme from Blaster Patrol 9, and Zira stared after him, completely disarmed. No threats, no shouting, just food, humor, and a rock that may or may not be carnivorous. Her stomach growled. Betrayal. An hour passed, maybe more. The twin suns began to dip, turning the canopy into a fiery mural. From her hiding spot, Zira watched Jack wrestle a collapsible tent into something vaguely resembling a shelter. He kicked it twice, then saluted it like an old friend. "Good job, tent," he muttered. "You're less evil than the last one." She crept closer under cover of a vine-thick tree. He was boiling water in a dented kettle using a jury-rigged thermal coil. Beside him, 2 mugs sat, one steaming, one waiting. "Figured you'd be curious," he said without looking up. "You're not the first weird alien I've met. You are the first one who hasn't tried to sell me insurance, though. So you've got that going for you." Zira tilted her head. She stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, her eyes locked on the mug. He gestured toward it. "Synth root tea. Found the plant myself. It only tried to eat me twice." She sat across from him, still cautious, but her body aching for warmth. She took the mug, sniffed it, and found it shockingly palatable. He raised his in a toast. "To improbable friendships and mutually assured dehydration." Zira sipped. "Not bad." He smiled. Something deep in her chest, a knot of fear and conditioning, loosened by a fraction. Not trust, not yet, but maybe curiosity. Maybe the faint, foolish idea that not everything humans touch turned to ruin. And as a particularly aggressive toaster drone buzzed low overhead and Jack lobbed a nearby rock at it with a "get your own campsite," Zira did something she hadn't done since before the crash. She laughed. By the second morning, she decided he was either a harmless idiot or the most dangerously subtle operative in the galaxy. He hummed while brushing his teeth with a stick he insisted had natural bristles, then proceeded to shave with something that looked suspiciously like a repurposed drone propeller. When she asked, using a combination of standard and awkward hand signals, if it was sharp enough, he shrugged and said, "Only nicked an artery once." Zira had slept curled in her own corner of the camp, shielded by a trio of angled metal panels from the wreckage. Jack had added a tarp to them overnight and carved what he called moisture grooves into the dirt. She wasn't sure if they actually worked or if they were an elaborate excuse for digging, but the gesture was oddly thoughtful. When she awoke, he was already crouched by the fire pit, fiddling with a device that whined like an anxious mosquito. "Auto kettle's refusing to boil," he muttered. "I think it's trying to unionize." She offered a polite blink. "Don't look at me like that. Machines have feelings. That one over there hasn't forgiven me since I tried to cook noodles in it." The kettle shrieked and belched steam. "See? Spite." Breakfast was some kind of root paste that tasted faintly of cinnamon and despair. Jack scarfed his down like a man who hadn't had real food in weeks, which, judging by the state of his boots and his odd tan lines, was probably true. Zira picked at hers with all the enthusiasm of someone reading diplomatic reports on fuel tax restructuring. They ate in relative silence, the kind that hovered somewhere between awkward and companionable. Jack occasionally made a joke about how many limbs something with that many eyes should have, and Zira, in spite of herself, started keeping mental tally of his logic failures. When he insisted that rocks with moss on top were sentient introverts, she corrected his mass calculations just to annoy him. He beamed like she'd offered him a medal. Later that day, they set out to salvage more from the crash site. Zira insisted on returning to the core pod herself, mumbling about retrieval codes and shielding panels. Jack trailed behind, carrying a sack of tools and talking about the time a gravity inverter turned his laundry room into an accidental meat locker. She didn't understand half of it, but the cadence of his voice was strange and lulling, like a machine tuned slightly off frequency, but still running. They reached the site and began picking through the debris. Zira found one of the secondary batteries and crowed in triumph, softly to herself, before Jack yelled, "Heads up!" and tossed her a section of fuselage. It bounced off a nearby tree and thudded into the mud beside her. "Almost caught it," he said brightly. She stared at him. "Okay, maybe next time I'll warn you before throwing something dense and metallic." She considered the practicality of firing the battery at his head, just to return the favor. Instead, she sighed and got back to work. They labored under the thin, flickering sky for hours. Zira retrieved several intact pieces of her transmitter, tucked them into a makeshift satchel, and allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope. The transcore was salvageable. With enough power, she might even be able to send a directional burst, short range, but enough to reach a relay, enough to signal the Alaran fleet. Jack noticed the change in her expression. "Good news?" She hesitated. "Maybe." He gave her a thumbs up. "Fantastic. Optimism's the second best survival tool." She glanced at him. "What's the first?" "An irrational hatred of giving up." When they returned to camp, the sun, or whatever counted for a sun on this planet, was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. Zira sat cross-legged near the fire, her tools spread around her like a ceremonial circle. She began repairs with a precise, almost ritualistic focus. Jack, meanwhile, had decided the perimeter sensors needed an upgrade. His idea of an upgrade involved hanging tin cups from strings and balancing rocks on tree limbs. "If anything moves through here," he explained, "we'll hear the world's worst symphony." Zira didn't look up. "That's not how sensors work." "You say sensors, I say performance art." Later, as the sky shifted to its nocturnal palette of bruised silver and flickering indigo, she finally asked, "Why are you alone?" Jack didn't answer right away. He was poking at the fire with a stick, watching sparks drift upward like tiny fleeing stars. "Scout ship," he said at last. "Not much crew. We hit something in orbit. Didn't see it coming. Probably a derelict. Maybe a mine. Doesn't matter now." She nodded. Loss was universal, even across species. "I wasn't supposed to land here," he added, voice softer. Just like you weren't. She almost asked what he'd been scouting for, but the way his expression shuddered told her not to. Everyone had a boundary. Some people posted guards there. Jack made bad jokes and built rock sculptures shaped like confused animals. A flicker from the transcore caught her eye. It was glowing, just faintly, an amber pulse like a tired heartbeat. She hid her reaction, but Jack saw something in her body language shift. He smiled, but there was no teasing this time. Almost there? Maybe. Good. I'll try not to blow us up in the meantime. The next few days blurred into a strange rhythm. Work, scavenging, weird campfire meals, and long conversations that wandered between nonsense and startling truths. Jack taught her a game involving flat stones, precise angles, and the promise of launching them into orbit. She taught him how to recalibrate a sensor using only conductive bark and patience. They laughed more than she expected, argued over nothing, shared silences without the need to fill them. One night, when a storm rolled in without warning and their tarp flapped like it was auditioning for a horror play, Jack shouted over the wind, "If we die, I just want you to know, I never figured out which one of your tools was the spoon." Zira, soaked and exhausted, laughed until she couldn't breathe. The storm passed. The stars returned. And in the stillness, she found herself looking at the man beside her and wondering not how he had survived so long alone. But why? Zira stood knee-deep in ferns that emitted soft static every time she moved. Her fingers worked quickly, attaching the last filament to the transcore's power relay, sweat trickling down the side of her face despite the cooler night air. The battery Jack had salvaged from his own ship, generously described by him as not entirely exploded, had just enough charge to give the unit a single, sharp pulse. One message, one chance. After that, the core would fry itself. And maybe the moss. And probably the raccoon-sized lizard that had been watching them for the last 3 days like it was planning a property dispute. Behind her, Jack held a stick like a conductor's baton, directing the winds as if they might perform a concerto. "Whenever you're ready, maestro." Zira shot him a look. "If this misfires, it will level this whole clearing. Then I will die in the service of great art." She tapped the coil. "It's a signal burst, not a fireworks display." "You say that, but you haven't seen how I celebrate success." With a deep breath, she placed her hand flat against the core. A warm hum rose from beneath the casing. The diagnostic lights flickered green, then orange, then settled into a steady white pulse. Her heart beat in time with it. Jack, watching from a few meters back, crouched and said quietly, "You ready to go home?" She didn't answer. The question had too many sharp edges. The transcore emitted a low chime. Confirmation. Her message had gone out, encoded and tagged with her fleet's priority cipher. If anyone was within the quadrant, they'd hear it, maybe even pick it up in time to send a ship before the moss grew into their sleeping bags. Zira exhaled slowly and sat back on her heels. She felt light, like the moment just after stepping off a dropship and before gravity reasserted its usual disdain. Jack flopped onto the ground beside her, chewing on a stick that was either gumwood or a very confused insect. "So now what?" "Now we wait," she said. "Fantastic. I'll get the emergency board games." Waiting, as it turned out, lasted 2 days. The first day passed with nervous pacing, system checks, and one spirited debate over whether the odd bird-like creatures in the treetops were singing or mocking them. Jack voted for mocking. Zira wasn't sure they were even alive. By the second day, the waiting grew heavier. Jack began telling stories, half of which she was sure were fabrications. One involved a sentient vending machine uprising, the other a misunderstanding with a mining colony, and a suspiciously high number of inflatable ducks. "You tell too many lies," she told him once. He grinned. Not lies, emotionally accurate exaggerations. They were eating another questionable meal when the beacon cracked the sky. It came in low, a shimmering wedge of burnished alloy that shimmered at the edges like folded light. Zira stood frozen as the hum of its engines tickled the fillings in her back teeth. It hovered, sleek and predatory, before descending with precise grace into the clearing. Jack muttered something about show-offs. The hatch opened. Out stepped 2 Alaran officers, both in polished uniforms, both immediately leveling scanners in Zira's direction. She straightened instinctively, hands at her sides, jaw set. The taller of the two barked, "Identification!" She gave it. They confirmed it, eyes widening a fraction. One gestured to the ship. "You're expected. There's a diplomatic vessel in orbit." Jack made a quiet ooh noise. The shorter officer glanced at him. "Human?" Zira nodded. "Threat level?" She hesitated. Jack was currently trying to coax a small squirrel-lizard hybrid out of his pack by pretending to be a tree. Not especially threatening. "Low," she said. The officers barely looked at him again. The moment stretched. Zira stood between two paths. One was duty, orders, the polished clarity of the life she'd been born into. The other was Jack. Wild cards, fire pits, songs about rocks, and laughter, real and absurd and warm. She turned back toward him. "They came." He nodded. "Quiet now." "Looks like it." "Will you be all right?" Jack shrugged, but there was a softness to the motion. "Sure. Me and the aggressive toaster drone have formed a pact." She smiled despite herself. "You ever visit Earth," he added, "I'll show you what real coffee tastes like and how to cook noodles without terrifying appliances." She stepped forward. Their eyes met. "You're strange," she said. "Thank you." "And kind." He blinked. "That one I'm not used to hearing." Zira reached into her satchel and pulled out a small device, a spare locator beacon. She pressed it into his hand. "If you ever end up in trouble again, send a ping." He looked down at it, then up at her. "And you'll come flying in with a transcore and a scowl?" "Something like that." The officers cleared their throats. She turned away, walking toward the ship. Each step felt oddly heavy, as if the planet itself didn't want her to go. As if part of her didn't either. She stopped at the ramp, looked back. Jack was waving, a ridiculous flailing gesture that somehow made her laugh through the tightness in her chest. She boarded the vessel, the hatch sealed behind her with a hiss. She felt the familiar shift of gravity as the ship lifted, engines smoothing the turbulence. The officers murmured into their comms. Screens flickered to life. As the planet shrank beneath them, a green smear against the stars, Zira sat alone in the passenger bay and looked at her reflection in the glass. She saw herself, uniform tattered, ears still twitching from old reflexes. But something in her face was different, lighter, freer. She had faced fear, found kindness, chosen to believe in a smile instead of a weapon, and it had changed her. Not into someone new, but into someone braver. Somewhere far below, Jack probably already had a new pet, or was chasing after that squirrel lizard again. Or maybe he was just watching the sky, wondering if she'd meant what she said. She had, because sometimes the smallest word could reshape a life. "Hello?" He wasn't sure if the glowing restraints were supposed to be warm, but they were. Elias Court flexed his wrist subtly, testing the translucent bands that looped from palm to palm, humming with an energy that looked like lime jelly, but probably had a higher melting point than dignity. He stood in the center of the celestial tribunal hall, alone on a dais made from something that might have been crystal or a very snooty kind of ice. Above him loomed the great dome of the chamber, refracting the swirling patterns of nebulae like a kaleidoscope with a superiority complex. To his left, an octagonal creature in judicial robes emitted a series of vibrating pulses, each accompanied by the clatter of 3 translator drones struggling to keep up. The translation finally resolved into something bureaucratic and moist-sounding. "State your defense, human Elias of Earth. You have precisely 3.2 inner time units. Failure to deliver a compelling argument will result in planetary deconstruction." Elias cleared his throat. It sounded loud in the vast silence of the hall, like a man trying to casually apologize in a museum where everyone's already staring. He opened his mouth, considered lying, then remembered Earth's situation and thought, well, maybe not today. "So, hi, right, defense. I was told this was more of a plea deal scenario, but sure, we can go formal." From her throne, an angular construct of obsidian light and softly warping geometry, Queen Seraphine Vel did not blink. That might have been because she didn't need to, but it felt personal. She sat with the stillness of ancient equations, her face unreadable, Her long ears angled slightly backward in what Elias was starting to understand might be royal disdain or mild boredom. Her armor shimmered like a warning. No crown, though. He appreciated that. Crowns made it harder to pretend someone wasn't about to vaporize you. I'd like to begin, Elias said, by pointing out that I'm not technically authorized to represent Earth in this capacity. I'm more of a happenstance envoy, which is like a diplomat, only nobody meant to pick me. This earned no response, but one of the noble council members, a being shaped like a jellyfish having an existential crisis, issued a shrill oscillation of contempt. Elias continued, I get it. We're not great neighbors. We yell a lot. We pollute. We keep inventing things we don't understand and then act surprised when they explode. But we're trying. I mean, okay, not all of us, but some of us. Well, me, I'm trying. Right now. Seraphine's gaze didn't shift. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrests of her throne. Talon-gloved, perfectly still. Elias fought the urge to nervously compliment her furniture. And you're going to say, trying isn't enough, human Elias. And you'd be right. It isn't. Not when it comes to galactic politics or responsible terraforming or, not launching waste into local wormholes. Sorry about the blarg sector, by the way. That was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays are hard. Still nothing. He tried to keep his breathing steady. The tether sizzled faintly as he adjusted his footing. Look, I'm not here to convince you that Earth is special. It's not. We're a blue ball with commitment issues and a tendency to elect the wrong people. But there are good things there. Article laughter, sandwiches. A slight twitch. The left ear. Barely. Alyssa's heart jumped like a caffeinated squirrel. Yes, sandwiches. They're like nutrient assemblies, but tastier. They say a lot about our culture. For example, we once fought an entire war over the correct layering order of tomato, lettuce, and he stopped himself. No, that's a lie, but only just barely. The tribunal hummed disapproval. The air thickened with ceremonial judgment. Somewhere near the edge of the hall, a Helianthian scribe fainted into his cloak. I know I'm not what you expected, Elias said more quietly now. You wanted someone important, impressive, with medals and speeches. But what you got is a guy who got arrested for climbing a restricted antenna tower with a toaster strapped to his back because he thought he could bounce a signal off a passing cruiser. Which, by the way, worked, just not the way I planned. The Queen stirred. Her voice when it came was low and level and deadly in its precision. Do you offer this clownery as defense or as a final insult to this court? Elias tried not to smile. Is it working as either? A pause, a breath, a silence deeper than vacuum. You are the final voice of your species, Seraphine said. Your words weigh heavier than you understand. I think I understand more than you think I do, Elias replied and meant it. Because I've seen what power looks like, and it's not always cold. Sometimes it's scared. Sometimes it laughs. Sometimes it listens. Another twitch. Right ear this time. He leaned forward slightly against the flickering hum of the tether. You could destroy us. You could. But then you'd never know what might have happened if you hadn't. Maybe that's a tiny thing to offer, but sometimes tiny things matter, like sandwiches. This time, something almost imperceptible changed in the way Seraphine held herself. The weight in the room tilted. The jellyfish judge trembled in what might have been horror. Somewhere above, the cosmic mural in the dome shimmered, its nebulae reshaping ever so faintly into something new. Enough, Seraphine said. She stood and the throne retracted as though ashamed. Her silhouette carved the space around her like a monolith wrapped in secrets. You will not be destroyed, she declared, and a gasp rippled through the tribunal. Elias blinked. Wait, what? Seriously? Not yet, she said, turning. You amuse me, but amusement is not survival. As she departed, her voice echoed back across the chamber, cool and final. This is your last chance, human. Earn it. Elias looked down at the glowing tether as it unspooled and vanished. He rubbed his wrist thoughtfully. Earn it, he muttered. No pressure. Then under his breath. I wonder if they have coffee on this death ship. Behind him, the jellyfish judge sighed with the weight of several millennia. The Queen's private chamber aboard the Vox Calestis was larger than most Earth embassies, and arguably more emotionally distant. The walls pulsed faintly in shades of violet and gold, translating Seraphine's mood into decor through a biosensitive alloy known to become violently green when offended. Elias tried very hard not to offend the walls. He failed approximately every 3 minutes. So, he said, pacing beside an angular console that whispered softly every time he got too close. Just to recap, I, a thoroughly underqualified human with a solid C average in galactic ethics, am now the diplomatic linchpin holding Earth back from interstellar deletion. Did I miss anything? The silence answered him with poise. The kind of poise usually reserved for funeral processions or gourmet chefs considering violence. Seraphine stood by the viewport, long ears arched like question marks, her posture flawless in a way that made Elias feel like his spine had been assembled incorrectly at birth. You are not the linchpin, she said, her voice crisp as the air in cryochambers. You are the final coin tossed into a galactic well. I am waiting to see if it sinks or sings. Do coins normally sing in your culture? She didn't answer, but one of the glowing wall panels turned a shade that Elias suspected meant, try again, clown. He cleared his throat. I just want to say, in a totally non-defensive way, that Earth is kind of difficult to represent. We're a mixed bag. Some of us are brilliant, some are brave, some are really, really into podcasts, and some like me, well, we're persistent. You are stubborn, Seraphine replied, turning to face him at last. That is not always a virtue. It is if you're arguing with a sentient bureaucracy, he said, or trying to get a decent sandwich at an interplanetary food kiosk. Her gaze remained unreadable, but the wall near the entrance briefly flickered chartreuse. Why are you like this? She asked. Like what? Insufferable, incapable of submission. You joke at death. You stumble toward doom with grins and metaphors. Your species is chaos in bipedal form. We try not to be bipedal when we're swimming, Elias offered. But sure, we're messy. Maybe that's what makes us interesting. She tilted her head, ear flicking with an emotion he couldn't name. You see yourself as interesting? I see myself as lucky, he said more quietly now. Lucky to be here. Lucky to be alive. And maybe a little lucky that you didn't atomize me on the tribunal floor. That option remains. Sure, but if you were going to, you'd have done it already. You're not one for idle threats. Do not pretend to understand me. I'm not, I'm guessing. Humans do that. Sometimes we get it wrong. Sometimes we get very lucky and get it surprisingly right. He didn't expect the silence that followed to stretch. She studied him, and for the first time since he'd met her, Elias saw something behind the icy posture and imperial control. Something uncertain, something curious. And if he wasn't wrong, a flicker of exhaustion. Not physical, but the kind that sets in after centuries of ruling over beings who never quite stop disappointing you. Very well, she said at last. Let us test your guesswork. You will join me on a diplomatic excursion, a world at war, a conflict as ancient as my own command. If you can bring them to speak, even briefly, I may consider Earth's fate postponed. That's the mission? Do you decline? No, I didn't pack a bag. You will not need one. The atmosphere is lethal to humans. Elias blinked. Oh, good. Within the hour, he was suited in an exo-environmental rig that whispered apologies to his skin every time he moved. The Queen's personal vessel detached from the main cruiser in a sleek drift, flanked by escort drones shaped like aggressive sea creatures. Elias tried not to look out the viewport. So this planet, he said, voice muffled slightly by the helmet. Do the locals hate each other more than they hate outsiders? They have forgotten how to define outsider, Seraphine replied. They now only define enemy. That's bleak. That is history. Touchdown was less a landing and more a statement. The craft embedded itself into the red-soiled terrain of Turvane 9 with a hiss of automated precision, while local fauna scattered in shades that shouldn't exist. Two factions met them with weapons drawn, one side armored in obsidian mesh, the other in woven light. Elias stepped between them with his hands raised and his translator set to maximum optimism. Hi. Yes, greetings. No need to disintegrate me. I'm just here for a chat. The obsidian leader snarled. The light-armored commander frowned. You are meat, the first said. You are irrelevant, the second added. I get that a lot, Elias said cheerfully, but I also bring snacks. They paused. Elias unzipped a compartment in his suit and pulled out two small containers. Inside, sandwiches. Not replicated, not synthesized. Actual old-fashioned Earth sandwiches, smuggled past interstellar customs through a miracle and a misunderstanding involving diplomatic immunity and a blind caterer. They contain no weaponry, he said, unless you count too much mustard. It was ridiculous, it was absurd, and it worked. They didn't shake hands, they didn't sign treaties, but they sat, and they chewed. And for a moment the talking began, not with demands or accusations, but with confusion and grudging curiosity. Back aboard the vessel, as the diplomatic logs updated and the Queen reviewed the footage, she sat still for a long time. Then she played back the moment where Elias said, "Peace begins with a sandwich," and shook her head once. Her aide approached, hesitant. "Shall I record this as progress?" "No," she said, but not unkindly. "Record it as interference. Persistent, inconvenient interference." Then after a moment, "And request more sandwiches." The Peace Summit was held inside a structure that looked like a cathedral, built by someone who had only ever read descriptions of cathedrals written by insects. The walls breathed slightly. The floor hummed with non-directional music. The chairs adjusted themselves depending on the species sitting in them, which for Elias meant his seat turned into something that resembled an aggressively supportive beanbag. He sat beside Queen Seraphine Vel, who, in a dramatic departure from tradition, had dismissed her ceremonial guard and arrived in a suit that looked suspiciously like something approximating comfort. Not human comfort, but the galactic equivalent of, "Today, I'm not vaporizing anyone before breakfast." Her ears were tilted at a neutral angle, and that, Elias had learned, was as close as she got to expressing optimism. The delegates arrived in slow waves. The sentient clouds from the nebular accord floated in, all trailing diplomatic vapor. The crystalline spiders of Zinthel clicked across the floor and immediately began negotiating seating preferences in frequencies no one else could hear. Even the two Tervain 9 war leaders arrived, separately of course, but they nodded at each other. Elias counted that as progress. When the meeting began, it was with the customary droning of the council harmonizer, who had the personality of a damp envelope and the voice of someone who'd been designed to ruin parties. Elias leaned toward Seraphine. "So, just to be clear, we're not the opening act? Because I left my juggling rockets in the room." "You will speak when I instruct," she said, but her voice lacked venom. If anything, it held a trace of amusement, like she was still trying to figure out whether or not he was an elaborate prank played on her by the universe. He nodded, adjusted in the beanbag, and tried not to fall asleep, while the Heliodians proposed an interspecies currency based on emotional transparency. Things escalated quickly when the Syntalics objected on the grounds that feelings were a form of biological fraud. It was 3 hours in, just after the synthetic tea service, and just before the Zinthel began debating the legal definition of mild treason, when Seraphine stood. The hall fell quiet. No humming floor, no musical walls, no muttering diplomats. Even the spider delegates stopped clicking. She gestured to Elias. "This human," she said, her voice perfectly balanced between thunder and silk, "was not selected. He was not chosen by a council, nor trained in the arts of diplomacy. He is not the finest mind Earth has to offer, nor the most eloquent." "Strong opening," Elias muttered to himself. She continued, "And yet, when given the impossible, he responded not with aggression, but with absurdity. When offered extinction, he offered sandwiches." Someone near the back coughed in confusion. "He has disrupted my certainty," she said. "He has irritated me beyond reason, and in doing so, he has reminded me that the future is not forged only by logic or decree, but by anomaly, by persistence, by the maddening possibility of change." There was a silence. Then someone clapped. It sounded like two spoons hitting a xylophone, but Elias appreciated the effort. Soon other sounds joined, tentative, unsure, but growing. Applause across species is more of a vibe than a technique. Seraphine turned to him. You may now speak. Elias stood, awkwardly peeling himself out of the beanbag chair like a caterpillar emerging from a very undignified cocoon. He cleared his throat. So, he began, here we are, a lot of us, most of us, all trying to figure out how not to blow each other up. Again. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. One burped plasma. I won't pretend to be wise, he said. I once mistook a recycling chute for a urinal. That's not relevant. I just want everyone to calibrate expectations. He took a breath. But here's what I've seen. Wars that have gone on so long, no one remembers the first lie that started them. Empires so vast they forget the faces of their own people. And yet, there's laughter. There's the willingness to sit down, even just for 5 minutes, and try a sandwich from someone you used to hate. More silence. This time it didn't feel heavy, just listening. I don't know what peace looks like, he said, but maybe it starts small, with one ridiculous moment, one unexpected kindness, one person who won't shut up even when the queen tells him to. Seraphine's lips might have twitched. Elias chose to interpret it as affection. I'm not here to fix everything. I'm here to prove it's worth trying. That Earth, for all its screw-ups, believes that trying matters. He sat. The beanbag, now sentient and emboldened by purpose, adjusted to support his lower back. The rest of the summit played out in ripples, like dropping a stone into a pond full of very argumentative fish. There were no treaties signed that day, but delegates talked. They passed notes. The Turvey 9 leaders agreed to a truce contingent on continued sandwich imports. Someone from the Nebular Accord made a joke. It wasn't funny, but it was a start. Later aboard the Vox Calestis, as the stars slid silently past the viewing deck, Elias found Seraphine standing alone. You know, he said, approaching slowly, that speech was the nicest anyone's ever been to me while still calling me irritating. She glanced at him. You remain irritating, but useful. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the stars. You've altered something, she said. In the tribunal, in the council, in me. Well, he said, that's what humans do. We show up, we poke things, and then we either evolve or explode. Her ears shifted. He had come to understand this as the equivalent of a sigh. And what now, Elias of Earth? I don't know, he admitted. Maybe I stay. Maybe I go back home and open a tiny intergalactic deli. Serve sandwiches and stories. Let people sit across from someone they don't understand and still find something to share. A diplomatic deli, with really good mustard. A long pause. Stay, she said. He turned to her. Really? You amuse me, she said, as if that explained everything. Maybe in her way it did. He nodded, feeling something settle in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but the peculiar gravity of belonging, of having mattered, even if only a little. All right, he said, but I'm bringing real bread next time. The replicators still can't get the crust right. Seraphine said nothing, but her ears, ever so slightly, tilted forward. Interested, open. And beyond the ship, the stars kept burning, slowly, patiently, just like change.